So this work for the NZSO was part of its Tuia 250 commissions, and it commissioned 4 New Zealand composers on a series of themes related to the 250th anniversary of Cook's arrival in New Zealand. But they're quite diverse themes, and the particular theme I ended up choosing was sort of around the idea of knowledge or Mātauranga, and not just Cook's knowledge as well, but the forms of artistic knowledge and cultural knowledge that he encountered when arriving in New Zealand. I was keen to, first of all, incorporate taonga puoro, which is a very integral part of this composition. There are 2 reasons. One was, in some ways, taonga puoro is the form of Mātauranga Māori that I have had the most involvement with. I've never written for taonga puoro before, but I have certainly been to numerous workshops with performers, to noho marae, wānanga, and I felt I was just getting to a point in my understanding of these instruments where I could collaborate with a performer, and it's been 25 years or so since I went to my very first workshop on taonga puoro, so it's sort of taken me that long to feel I have enough understanding of the instruments and the meanings and tikanga of the instruments to do some justice to them. There is usually quite a lot of collaborative interrelationship between performer and composer when writing for taonga puoro. This piece probably had slightly less collaboration, actually, in some senses than most pieces. The reason being that for this piece I wanted a really integrated sound between the taonga puoro and the orchestra, to the point where essentially the orchestra amplifies and resonates the sounds of the taonga puoro. That meant I needed to actually compose essentially the taonga puoro part, which is pretty unusual. Normally in taonga puoro music there's just space for improvisation, but for this piece, in order to make that tight integration, the taonga puoro part is largely written out, albeit with rhythmic flexibility for the performer. There are 1 or 2 small spots of improvisation, but otherwise it's actually largely composed. And so essentially the collaboration was more with Al in terms of the choice of instruments. I was particularly interested in instruments that were made from the flora and fauna of Aotearoa. So I wasn't so interested in the emu bone flute he had, for example, not being a native bird. Instead, I have the albatross bone flute and the native woods and other, plants and animals from this country. And then just getting him to essentially play the instruments for me in a short workshop session that we had, just so I could get an idea of the ranges of them and the pitches that they could produce, and I guess the kinds of melodic ideas that he would have. But other than that, I then composed the parts for the taonga puoro at that point. About time for me, to write for taonga puoro, but also to use my live electronics system that I've been building up over the last decade, essentially, in a more ambitious environment, and incorporating them with an orchestra is about as ambitious as you can get. I was quite interested in a particular type of live electronics that sustains the incoming sound and shapes it, so it makes these sort of wave-like shapes. And you can, for example, capture 3 different notes and these waves will sort of overlap. So there was slightly that water metaphor, which is particularly audible at the beginning when Al plays the puoro. I capture that sound and granulate it, and it really sounds like sort of surf breaking on a beach or something like that. So there's very much this wave-like water metaphor that works in with the narrative of a journey across the sea. So I was playing around with the live electronics before I wrote any of the orchestral parts, and I decided I wanted the electronics to act as this glue between the soloist and the orchestra. So the orchestra, for the most of the piece, imitates actually the live electronics, which are deriving from Al's sound. So yeah, they act as this important sonic glue in between the two worlds. My role was actually simply to trigger the live electronics. All the settings of the live electronics were pre-programmed. So essentially they're just walking through a series of states, but there's quite a lot of states in the piece. There's about 84 or 85 different trigger points in the piece. And the triggers all come from Al's part. So I have to listen for him to hit a particular note, and then I trigger that, which basically grabs the sound at that instant and does something with it. And as the piece moves, the old sounds die away and the new sounds come in. So it's sort of like a what's called a sort of first in, first out buffer. So yeah, the early sounds come in and they stick around for a while, but then once the buffer is filled up with all the various other sounds, then they start dropping out. And so you get this gradually shifting and morphing texture throughout the whole piece. I think having your piece performed publicly for the first time is quite a rich tapestry of emotions for a composer, I should say. Obviously, there's all the attendant emotions of nervousness and excitement and so on, but I think there's also a kind of, I think particularly if it's a piece that's gone well in rehearsal, there's a certain kind of satisfied relief at having it finally out there. And not all pieces go smoothly in rehearsal, it has to be said, but this one went pretty well. The main things we were working on was just sort of integrating between Carlos the conductor and Al the soloist, because his part is quite freely written, but there are a few places where he has to follow specific cues from the conductor, and so it was largely a logistical thing. There wasn't much we needed to tweak in the actual composition. There were a few little tempo changes and a few pauses that we added just to allow, particularly the time for the live electronics. We realised when we were doing it with the live electronics, there were a few places that just needed a bit more space, and having that component allowed the sound to just sit and resonate in the hall. So once we got there on the night, for me there was also the added nervousness that I was running the live electronics and were they going to work or not. And after about the third or fourth time playing that around the North Island, I really got to enjoy that, and that didn't concern me once I realised the system was pretty robust. I'm really honoured again to be in the finals for the SOUNZ Contemporary Award. I am aware that white middle-aged male, particularly that there is a sort of a history of that in classical music, and I know that this piece particularly stands on the work of others, particularly those who are developing the discipline of taonga puoro and really bringing it into contemporary music. So I do want to acknowledge those, particularly Matua Richard Nuns, of course, but then those who have followed in developing these beautiful instruments, that people such as Horomona Horo, Ariana Tikau, Al Fraser, James Webster, Warren Warbrick, all those who are really sort of discovering more about these instruments, pushing them into really new contexts, and discovering new sounds, new things to do with them. This piece is really builds off the back of that, so I don't know I can claim full credit for this piece, but it is also, I think, wonderful to see the diversity of work, particularly the works by Alex, working with robotics, and Celeste, whose music is always innovative and thought-provoking. The three finalists are so different, but also quite unconventional in many ways. So I think it's a real testament to the liveliness and diversity of the work that's going on in this sector in Aotearoa at the moment.